"They're hurting my mom!" The little girl cried to the bikers. And what they did next changed that family's life forever. The sun was still licking the horizon when the deep roar of 3 Harley-Davidsons shattered the silence of the road. The dry wind kicked up red dust around their thick tires, and the engines rumbled like ancient thunder across the forgotten plains of the countryside. The rusted sign of the mountain diner swung lazily atop a pole, creaking like a warning. The bikes parked in a neat line, like war horses. The first to step off was a tall man with a trimmed beard and eyes hidden behind scratched sunglasses. The black leather jacket on his back carried the flaming skull and wings of the Hells Angels. His name was Logan Carter, the kind of man who spoke little but carried whole stories behind his eyes. Next came Blake, a mountain of a man with arms like logs and a face that looked allergic to smiles, and Jason, the youngest of the 3, Latino, talkative, but with a gaze that never wavered. They walked into the diner, and the air shifted. The bell over the door jingled once, then silence fell. Truckers, families on the road, and 2 retired cops froze mid-motion, as if the presence of those men had sucked the air right out of the room. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with her hair tied in a bun and eyes that had seen too much, just sighed and grabbed 3 mugs. "Corner booth, same as always," she said before they could even ask. Logan gave her a small nod. The trio sat down. None of them removed their sunglasses. Blake picked up the menu but didn't bother reading it. "Black coffee and pancakes, no fancy stuff." Jason snapped his fingers and smiled at the waitress. "With bacon, sweetheart. And if there's no bacon, just bring whatever's fried." Logan only said, "Coffee?" The waitress headed to the counter, and the chatter slowly resumed. Quieter now. The sound of a fork tapping a plate, muffled country music from an old jukebox, the creak of worn-out vinyl seats. The place was a bubble of suspicion and fear. But Logan and the others didn't seem to care. They weren't there to start trouble, just to eat. Then the door burst open with a sharp crack. The bell screamed instead of ringing. A little girl in a torn red dress covered in dust stood at the entrance, panting, sobbing hard. She couldn't have been more than 7. Her eyes were red, her face streaked with dirt, her knees scraped raw. She could barely speak. "Please, someone help. My mom. He's hitting her again." Silence fell once more. But this time, it was different. The kind that screams on the inside. She collapsed to her knees. Her eyes begged for help. She pointed outside, toward something beyond the road. No one moved. A trucker looked away. A woman in the back pulled her kids close. One of the retired cops glanced at his buddy and shook his head. "Not our problem." That's when Logan stood up. Slowly, controlled. Like something old had just woken up inside him. He set his mug down gently, without looking at anyone, adjusted his jacket. Blake and Jason watched him for a moment, then rose too. No one said a word. It was as if the whole crew shared a silent code. Logan walked up to the girl and knelt beside her. She flinched out of reflex, but he didn't try to touch her. "Where?" he asked. She pointed with a trembling finger, past the gas station, beyond the brush. A cluster of trailers near the old tire depot. "It's close. He's hitting her really bad. She's screaming." Logan nodded once and stood. Jason was already heading for the door. Blake tossed some crumpled bills onto the counter. "Coffee can wait," he told the waitress. She didn't answer, just followed them with her eyes. Outside, the sun was already blazing. The 3 men mounted their bikes without a word. The engines roared louder than before, as if they knew this ride wasn't a casual one. The girl ran to the sidewalk and watched as the bikes sped off, kicking up a storm of dust that seemed to swallow the whole road. She stood there, breathing fast, fists clenched. Inside the diner, nobody spoke. But everyone knew. Those men, the feared Hells Angels, were riding into a war that wasn't theirs. The roar of the bikes sliced through the highway like a blade. Dust rose in thick clouds, covering the dry bushes and cracked asphalt. Logan rode in front, eyes locked on the horizon. The open helmet let the wind hit his face hard. There was no talk, no hesitation. They knew every second mattered. The little girl pointed the way, arm outstretched, barely keeping up in the old pickup truck driven by the gas station owner who'd offered to take her right after the bikers left. The cluster of trailers sat behind an abandoned tire yard, surrounded by tall weeds and scattered trash. One of those places where it's easy to scream, and nobody hears. Logan slowed down first. Blake and Jason stopped right behind him. Engines off. The sudden silence was deafening. The next sound left no doubt. Muffled screams, sharp blows, and something or someone slamming against a wall. "Back door," Logan said, glancing at Blake. "Now." Blake vanished between the trailers, moving surprisingly fast for a man his size. Jason stayed near the front door, alert, fingers tapping the pocket where he kept his knife. Logan took a deep breath, stared at the old wooden door, and then, crack! One kick was all it took. The door splintered inward. Inside, the heat was suffocating. The smell, sweat, alcohol, and blood. A big man, tattooed arms, torn shirt, bloodshot eyes full of rage, had his hand raised. The woman on the floor tried to shield her face with her arms. Blood ran from her nose. "Lauren!" he yelled, ready to hit again. But Logan was already on him. The impact landed square in the chest. The man stumbled back, crashing into a table. The floor shook. Logan followed through, knee to chest, elbow to throat. The guy fought back hard, raising his arm to strike, but Blake burst through the back door like a freight train, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it without mercy. "Stay the hell down," he growled. Jason pinned the man's legs, holding him down. The bastard thrashed like a trapped animal, cursing and spitting. "You sons of bitches! I'll kill you! I'll kill her again!" The words hit like lead. Logan punched him once, hard, straight to the gut. No flair, just purpose. The man gasped, air gone. Not unconscious, but broken. Blake pulled off his own belt and tied the guy's arms to the leg of the fallen table. Lauren was curled up in a corner, bleeding, her shirt torn. Her whole body trembled as if waiting for another hit. But now the silence was complete. The front door creaked. It was the girl, Sophie. She ran straight to Logan, throwing her arms around his legs, sobbing loud like he was the last solid thing left in the world. Logan, still kneeling, said nothing. He just placed a hand on her head, gentle, steady, like holding a rose. Blake stood up slowly, scanning the scene. Neighbors heard that, and indeed, behind cracked windows and grimy curtains, eyes began to appear, faces peeking out, doors half open, people who'd been there the whole time, listening, maybe watching, and never did a damn thing. Jason stepped to the door and shouted, "Call the cops!" No answer, but one window shut in a hurry. 5 minutes later, the distant wail of a siren cut through the heat. Lauren finally moved, tried to stand, but collapsed again. Logan went to her and helped her up without a word. Her eyes met his. You really came," she whispered. "Your daughter came first," he replied. The man on the floor groaned, trying to break free, spitting insults. Logan ignored him. The job was done. When the blue and white cruiser pulled up with lights spinning, Logan, Blake, and Jason were sitting on the trailer's porch rail. The girl still clinging to Logan. The woman barely standing. The man tied down. The officers got out fast, hands near their guns, expecting trouble. But there was no trouble. Only justice. One of the cops, young, looked confused. The older one frowned when he saw Logan. "You again?" Logan didn't answer. The cop looked from the man on the floor to Lauren. "It was him?" She nodded, voice barely audible. Since last night. I tried, but no one came. The cop crouched to check the man, then motioned for his partner to grab the cuffs. "And you three?" he asked, not bothering to finish the thought. Blake shrugged. Coffee had to wait. The cop looked at the little girl, her head now resting on Logan's chest, eyes closed. "We'll need statements." "Fine," Logan said, "but first, she needs to rest." The cop hesitated, then nodded. The neighbors were gone again. Curtains drawn, doors locked, silence. The same silence as before, only now it was broken. Red and blue lights danced across the shards of broken glass, casting warped reflections over Lauren's bruised face. The hum of the police cruiser's engine was the last sound before tension filled the air again. The two officers got out quickly. The younger one, hand near his holster, scanned everything with wide eyes. The older, a sergeant with broad shoulders, a lined face, and a voice worn from years of ordering and doubting, took in the scene with a hunter's precision, and he was the first to recognize him. "Logan Carter," he said, spitting the name like something stuck in his throat. Logan didn't reply. He sat on the porch rail, elbows on his knees, the little girl still tucked in his arms. Blake and Jason stood behind him, motionless. The ex-boyfriend, tied with a leather strap to the trailer post, was still yelling. "They broke into my house, wrecked everything, beat me up, I want my lawyer." Lauren stood against the wall, barely on her feet, dried blood at the corner of her mouth, hands shaking but eyes steady, for the first time in a long time. "He was hitting me, again. And Sophie ran to the road. They came before you did. If it weren't for them..." The sergeant stopped her with a hand gesture. He stepped closer to the man, examining the tight bindings around his arms and the wild, angry eyes. "You did this?" he asked, not looking at Logan. "The alternative was letting him finish," Logan answered quietly, steady. The silence that followed was heavy. The sergeant looked around. Overturned floorboards, broken table, splintered door, the bruises on Lauren's face and neck, the little girl clinging to the biker's chest, and in the middle of it all, 3 Hell's Angels. The same men he'd spent half his career keeping an eye on. They hadn't fled, they hadn't fought back, they hadn't provoked anyone. He turned to his partner. "Run the guy's ID and call for backup. Get someone from social services out here too." "Yes, sir." Lauren tried to take a deep breath, but it caught in her throat. He's done this before. More than once. But there were never witnesses. He'd say it was just a fight between us. This time, it was worse. I could feel it. The man laughed bitterly. "Oh, so now you're an actress? Tell him about the money you owe me. Tell him you started it." The sergeant didn't react. He crouched, snapped a photo of Lauren's injuries with his phone, then pointed a finger at the man. "Shut your mouth! Every word you say now just digs you deeper." The man's next scream was pure frustration, thrashing, cursing Logan as a thug, a criminal, a road rat. Logan stayed silent. But Sophie, small as she was, understood enough. She tightened her grip on his leather jacket, face buried against his chest, whispered, "He always says that. Says it's Mom's fault. Always blames us." The sergeant heard it. His jaw tightened for a moment. "Ambulance is on the way," he said to Lauren. "And someone from Child Services. They'll take care of you too." Lauren nodded, speechless. The sergeant then turned to Logan, looked at the belt holding the man in place, at the dried blood on Logan's knuckles, and finally, at the child still holding on to him. "You know, if you'd gotten here 5 minutes earlier and broken a little more, I'd have to book you." "I know," Logan said, "but she'd still be alive." The sergeant held his gaze a second longer, then gave a short nod, a silent truce, understanding, maybe even respect. "You're free to go, but don't leave town until we finish statements. This is going to turn into a serious case." "We're not going anywhere," Jason said for the first time, lighting a cigarette. Blake just grunted. The young cop came running back. Guys got priors, assault charges, 3 reports, 2 against the same woman. The sergeant nodded, like it didn't surprise him. Get him in the car. Careful with the cuffs. He'll want to put on a show. As the cops hauled the man off, still yelling, Lauren dragged herself toward her daughter, tried to lift her, but Sophie wouldn't let go of Logan. The biker looked at Lauren, silently asking permission. And she just nodded, crying quietly. She won't let go of you, she said, voice cracked. Not after what you did. Logan brushed a hand gently over the girl's hair, trying to comfort her, unsure how. She lifted her tear-streaked face and whispered, "You saved me." This time, Logan didn't know what to say, but his eyes that had seen too much darkness, carried something different for once, something he thought he'd lost: hope. The bikes rode back down the same dusty road, but the silence now was different. It wasn't the sound of danger coming. It was the sound of people returning with something precious, someone alive. On the back seat of Logan's bike, Sophie was curled up against him, her thin arms gripping his waist tightly. The helmet was far too big for her head. Lauren rode with Jason, eyes lost on the horizon, one hand gripping the sidebar like she was still trying to wake up from a nightmare. When the bikes stopped in front of the mountain diner, the waitress was already at the door. Behind her, customers had gone back to eating as if nothing had happened. But now they looked again, and their eyes were different. No one spoke, but no one looked away. Logan got off first. He lifted Sophie easily into his arms like it was the most natural thing in the world. She was light, limp, exhausted, but her arms still clung tightly around his neck. Lauren got off slowly, her knees wobbling, and leaned on Jason by reflex. He steadied her gently by the shoulders. The waitress broke the silence. "Come on in. It's warm in here." She opened the diner door and motioned toward the back. "I'll grab some blankets." Lauren hesitated, eyes still frightened, but followed. Blake stood by the door, holding it open like a guard on duty. The silence inside was heavy, but this time it was different. Respect. A man in a baseball cap, the same one who'd looked away earlier, stood up and gave up the corner booth. Logan sat down with Sophie still in his arms. He didn't order anything, but the coffee came anyway. A steaming mug landed on the table, along with a small glass of warm milk and a sweet roll wrapped in a napkin. "For her," the waitress said. "Didn't have what kids usually like, so I improvised." "That's perfect," Logan said, his voice softer now, almost gentle. Lauren appeared moments later, wrapped in a faded blue blanket. She walked slowly to the table, still in shock, but aware. Sat next to her daughter, stroked her hair and whispered, "It's all right now." Jason took off his leather jacket and, without saying a word, draped it over her shoulders. Lauren didn't refuse. She pulled the jacket close, like it was something too valuable for her to wear. Then the diner owner came out, a big gray-haired man with a face carved by time and war. Everyone knew he was ex-military. He walked up to Logan and stopped in front of him. The air grew heavier for a moment. "I always figured you guys were trouble," he said plainly. Logan looked up slowly, expecting criticism, maybe even a warning. But the old man continued. "Turns out I was wrong today." And he extended his hand. Logan shook it, a firm, brief handshake, heavy with 1,000 words unsaid. The town changed in that moment. A woman from the back booth, a mother of 2, the same one who had pulled her kids away earlier, came forward with a paper bag full of used clothes. "These might fit her, or the mom. It's not much, but it's what I've got." Another woman, with a scarf tied over her hair and the smell of menthol cigarettes, stepped up right after. "My niece works at a shelter near town. They take in women with kids. There's a spot open, and they've got a counselor too. I can call if you want. Lauren couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears filling her eyes. Blake sat at the counter, watching everything without expression. But when he saw Sophie shuffle over to him with a piece of bread in her hand, he did the unthinkable. He smiled. She climbed onto the stool next to him as if they'd been friends forever. "Want a sip of my milk?" she asked, showing him the nearly full glass. "Only if it's chocolate," Blake said with a mock frown. "If it's just milk? I'd rather drink gasoline." She giggled. And that laugh, light, pure, unexpected, shattered the last bit of tension in the air. Logan leaned against the counter, holding his coffee cup, watching it all unfold in silence. He looked out of place amid all that warmth, like a man used to being feared, not thanked. That kind of respect, quiet, human, sincere, wasn't something he knew how to handle. But he stayed. He stayed there, sipping hot coffee in silence, while the world around him slowly shifted. Outside, the sun was setting. The dust in the air turned golden, and for a brief moment, that forgotten little diner on a forgotten stretch of road felt like a piece of home. 3 days had passed since the night of the rescue. The rumble of engines had given way to constant silence, broken only by the clink of tools and the low hum of an old radio in the shop. It was there, in the back of the Hells Angels garage, that Logan Carter felt most like himself. His hands were stained with grease, bent over the engine of his Harley. A stuck piston had been bothering him for weeks, but now, with the sun dipping low and the shop empty, he could finally deal with it. Parts, oil, sweat, and focus. The kind of work that silences the mind. Almost. Sophie played near the door, sitting on a dusty blanket with crayons and torn paper. She drew with the seriousness of an adult. Lauren, meanwhile, sat in one of the old armchairs against the wall, wrapped in the same leather jacket Jason had given her back at the diner. Her eyes were lost on her daughter, as if she still couldn't believe they were there, alive. The police had allowed them to stay temporarily while the shelter situation was sorted out. No officer liked the idea of a woman and child living with bikers, but after what they'd seen, no one had the guts to tell Logan no. The orange light of sunset streamed through the dirty shop windows, and the smell of burned oil mixed with the cheap soap perfume Lauren used. She had been watching Logan for minutes. The way he focused on the engine, the calm he brought to the room, the kind of silence that didn't hurt. "You always fix things with your own hands?" she asked softly. Logan didn't answer right away. He fit the wrench, pushed hard, and the piston finally gave. Only then did he speak. "The ones worth fixing, yeah." Lauren smiled, but it was a broken smile. "I tried to leave before. 4 times. Always went back. Either he threatened me, or nobody wanted to help. Always that same look. She must have done something. Like the blood on my mouth was my fault." Logan wiped his hands on a filthy rag and finally looked at her. "And your daughter?" Lauren turned to Sophie, still drawing quietly. "She was born in that hell. Never had a choice. Learned to walk between fights, to sleep with the TV on to drown out the yelling, to hide her toys so he wouldn't smash them when he was drunk." She took a deep breath. "And somehow, she's still sweet." Logan stayed silent for a while, then sat down, closer to her. He pulled a crumpled cigarette from his jacket pocket and lit it with an old lighter, engraved by hand with the Hells Angels emblem. "My sister was like Sophie," he said at last. "Small, kind, always smiling. My father was the opposite, and my mother pretended not to see." Lauren didn't ask how it ended. She already knew. He never hit her in front of anyone, only when they were alone. Nobody helped. And when she finally tried to leave, he killed her from the inside, slowly. In the end, she jumped from their apartment balcony. The silence that followed was heavy, like concrete. "That's why you came," Lauren said. It wasn't a question. "It wasn't heroism," Logan replied. It was recognition. I saw it again. That same look, fear, loneliness, the damn indifference in everyone else's eyes. A tear rolled down Lauren's face, but she didn't cry. It was more exhaustion than sorrow. "Thank you for not looking away." Logan took a slow drag. The cigarette burned quietly between his fingers. "I don't get much right, but letting someone scream for help and do nothing, I can't do that." At that moment, Sophie stood up. Her small hands held a crumpled wildflower she'd picked from the weeds behind the shop. She walked up to Logan slowly, wordless, and offered it like she was giving him a medal. He looked at her surprised. "So you don't forget you're good," she said, her small voice steady, looking straight into his eyes as if reading his soul. Logan froze for a second. Then he took the flower, with the same hand that fixed engines and broke bones. He held it gently, like he was holding a secret. Sophie went back to her drawings. Lauren closed her eyes. And Logan sat there, the flower resting in his lap, feeling, for the first time in years, that someone might be seeing something in him he'd long stopped believing existed. Something good. The mountain diner wasn't the same anymore. The sign still creaked in the wind, the coffee was still strong, and the pancakes still came with too much butter. But something in that place had changed. In the left corner of the dining room, near the old jukebox, there was now a hand-painted wooden shelf filled with donated toys and children's books. Next to it, a wall covered with colorful drawings made with crayons and scraps of wrapping paper. An improvised mural. A mural of new beginnings. Lauren now worked there behind the counter, serving coffee with a shy smile. The heavy look of someone waiting for the next hit was gone. She had a new haircut, a name tag written in blue ink, and a different kind of tiredness in her body. The good kind, the kind that comes from surviving. Sophie went to school every day. She came back full of stories, shoes caked in mud and pockets full of pebbles. She liked to sit at the front booth of the diner and draw. Sometimes she sang softly. Sometimes she just stared out the window, still trying to make sense of the world. And the Hells Angels, they still came. Still big, loud, tattooed, surrounded by rumors. But now, when they arrived, the looks they got were different. Mothers no longer pulled their children away. Truckers didn't look down anymore. The diner owner always kept the corner booth open, the kind of respect that's reserved, not demanded. That morning, the sound of motorcycles came before the sun. Logan Carter walked into the diner with his usual stride. Calm, steady, like the floor itself knew he was there. He took off his sunglasses and hung his jacket on the hook by the door. And there was Sophie, waiting for him, sitting alone at the front booth. She stood up slowly, holding a brown envelope in her hands. She didn't smile right away. She just walked up to him like what she carried was too important to rush. "I made a drawing," she said. "It's for you." Logan took the envelope and opened it carefully. Inside was a crumpled piece of paper covered in fingerprints. In the center, a man in a black jacket faced a massive creature made of shadows, claws, and red eyes. Behind him, a little girl and a woman hugged each other, safe. At the top, written in crooked letters, "Real heroes don't wear capes. They wear leather." Logan stared at it for a long moment. The entire diner seemed to hold its breath. Lauren watched from the kitchen, silent. Even Blake, leaning on the counter, looked away. Without saying a word, Logan folded the drawing carefully. He opened his wallet and pulled out an old photo, a young woman with eyes that looked just like Sophie's. He slid the drawing behind the photo, pressed the worn leather of the wallet tightly in his hand. A tear threatened to fall. He didn't let it. Sophie held his hand for a moment. "Now you won't forget," she said, as if making a promise. Logan just nodded. And in that small nod there was more than 1,000 words, A silent pact, an understanding, a debt repaid not with violence, but with care. He put his jacket back on. Outside, the engines were already rumbling. Blake was on his Harley, Jason adjusting his sunglasses. Dust began to rise from the road. Logan paused at the door, glancing one last time at the mural. His drawing was already up there, pinned beside an orange sun, a blue dog, and a red heart. He took a deep breath and stepped outside. The roar of the motorcycles rose like thunder. But that day, no one was afraid. It was only the sound of someone moving on. And you? What did you think of this story? Sometimes, a hero just needs to stop and listen to a cry for help. And you? What would you do if you saw someone who needed it? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched something inside you, show it with a like and subscribe. That way, more people will hear stories that remind us there's still good left in the world.